There comes a moment when the game of push and pull no longer works. The avoidant who has been hiding behind walls, building armor out of distance, suddenly feels the sting of absence. Not because someone shouted, not because someone begged, but because the one they thought would always chase stopped. You see, real power is not found in pursuit, it's found in presence. When the anxious heart learns to stop running after validation and instead stands firm in the quiet strength of self-worth, the dynamic shifts. The avoidant begins to notice. Silence becomes a teacher, space becomes a mirror, and what was once taken for granted now feels painfully uncertain. When you stop begging someone to see you, when you no longer demand constant reassurance, something extraordinary happens. The noise fades, and in that silence, the avoidant is left alone with themselves. That is where the realization begins. They start to hear the echoes of what they've pushed away. They feel the absence of the warmth they once thought was guaranteed. And suddenly they begin to understand the cost of their walls. This is not about manipulation, this is about transformation. Because the moment you stop allowing your emotions to be controlled by another person's inconsistency, you reclaim your soul, you step into a higher state where love is not desperation but choice, and that choice radiates a confidence so undeniable that it shakes the avoidant awake. Boundaries become your shield, but also your beacon. When you say, "This is how I will be loved," "This is how I will be treated," without anger but with certainty, you force the avoidant to look inward. They see, maybe for the first time, that the one they thought they could push away is not waiting forever at the door. And confidence, true confidence, changes everything. When you rise from fear to certainty, when you no longer look at them as your source of completion, but as one possible reflection of love, you become magnetic. You no longer cling. You no longer plead. You simply exist in the fullness of your being. And that existence draws them closer, because it reveals what they've been blind to, the treasure of your presence. The final step, the most powerful of all, is letting go. Not in bitterness, not in revenge, but in freedom. You let go of the need to control the outcome. You let go of the fear of being abandoned. And in that release, the avoidant is confronted with a brutal truth. They are not the one in control anymore. They realize that in pushing you away, they risk losing the very thing their soul has been longing for, but has been too afraid to embrace. So when the anxious stops chasing, when they embody silence and strength, when they live in emotional mastery, the avoidant finally wakes up. They see the mistake, they feel the loss, and in that sacred moment of realization, the power shifts, not to punish, but to remind both souls of a higher truth. Love is never about fear, it's about freedom. The one who was afraid of being abandoned no longer fears. The one who was once afraid of intimacy no longer hides. And when that happens, the dance ends, and a new kind of union begins. When you think about relationships, especially the ones that feel like a battlefield between closeness and distance, the most profound shift often comes not from action, but from stillness. The anxious partner usually lives in motion, texting, calling, pursuing, explaining, overanalyzing, always trying to bridge the gap because silence feels unbearable. Yet what happens when that motion stops? What happens when the anxious no longer chases but instead chooses to stand in the fullness of their own presence? Something remarkable begins to unfold. The avoidant, who has built their safety around the predictability of pursuit, suddenly feels an unfamiliar emptiness. They are used to being the one with the upper hand, the one who retreats while knowing the other will come running. But when the anxious chooses stillness over pursuit, the rhythm of the relationship is broken, and that disruption carries power. Standing still doesn't mean giving up or withdrawing love. It means anchoring oneself in worth. It means realizing that love is not proven by constant pursuit, but by the ability to remain grounded in your own identity. Even when someone you care about pulls away, when an anxious partner begins to embody this truth, they stop feeding the cycle of chase and retreat. They stop reinforcing the avoidance illusion that closeness is suffocating and distance is safety. Instead, they communicate through energy, through presence, through the silent confidence that says, "And I'm here, but I'm not here to beg for what is already mine to give." The avoidant notices this shift in ways they may not even fully understand. Suddenly, the calls they expected don't come. The emotional pressure they once resented is gone. The neediness they used to justify their distance has dissolved. At first, they may feel relief as, they've finally created enough space. But very quickly, relief gives way to discomfort. Because in that stillness, in that absence of pursuit, the avoidant no longer has the reassurance that someone will always be there waiting. And when certainty vanishes, awareness begins. The avoidant starts to feel the presence of the anxious partner, not through noise, not through demands, but through contrast. The contrast between what was once predictable and what is now unknown. Presence is magnetic because it carries a message that words cannot express. It tells the avoidant, you cannot define me by your fear. You cannot measure my worth by your distance. This unspoken message lingers in the air like a mirror the avoidant cannot avoid looking into. They may try to dismiss it at first, convincing themselves that nothing has changed. Yet deep inside, they feel the shift. They feel the energy of someone no longer chasing, no longer proving, no longer desperate for scraps of affection. And that awareness plants a seed of realization. Perhaps they have mistaken love for weakness. Perhaps they've underestimated the strength of the one they thought would always run after them. Standing still creates impact because it breaks a pattern that has defined the relationship dynamic for too long. It forces the avoidant to confront their own fears, their own dependency on being pursued, their own hidden desire to be wanted without ever admitting it. The anxious partner's stillness becomes both a challenge and an invitation. It says without words, and I am no longer playing this game. If you want me, if you value me, it is now your move. And in that moment, the avoidant begins to realize the weight of their mistake. They realize that silence, when rooted in presence, speaks louder than 1,000 words. Silence has a way of cutting deeper than words ever could. When the anxious partner decides to stop explaining, stop demanding, stop repeating the same plea for closeness, what remains is space, empty, still, and powerful. For the avoidant, who has grown accustomed to noise, to pursuit, to the constant pull of someone trying to get closer, that silence is jarring. At first, it may feel like a relief. They might even interpret it as freedom, the absence of pressure. But as the days pass and the silence continues, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a mirror reflecting their own choices back to them. Without the anxious filling every gap, the avoidant has no distraction from themselves, no buffer between their walls and their loneliness. Silence is not punishment. It is a form of strength. It communicates without argument, without drama, without confrontation. It simply allows the avoidant to sit with what they have created. In the beginning, the avoidant may lean into their old patterns, convincing themselves that distance equals safety, that shutting down is better than opening up. Yet the longer the silence holds, the more they feel the absence of connect. Bion, what once felt suffocating begins to feel strangely missed. The anxious person's absence, their refusal to beg or demand, reveals how much of the relationship's energy was held together by their pursuit. Now, without it, the avoidant begins to feel the emptiness that has always been there, but was easier to ignore. There is a certain weight that silence carries. It doesn't chase, it doesn't explain, it doesn't justify, it simply exists. And in that existence, it awakens reflection. The avoidant starts hearing the echoes of what they used to resent, the messages, the questions, the longing. Except now they hear it only in their own head because no one is speaking it out loud anymore. That inner voice becomes uncomfortable because it is no longer drowned out by external noise. Silence creates space for awareness, and awareness cannot be easily dismissed once it begins to stir. What the avoidant begins to realize is that silence is not emptiness. It is a signal. It is the anxious part. Nair's way of saying, I no longer need to force you to see me. My presence speaks louder than my words. And that signal is powerful because it takes away the avoidance excuse. They can no longer claim they are being smothered. They can no longer point to neediness as the reason for their withdrawal. Instead, they are left with a choice: to step into the silence with vulnerability or to continue running and confront the risk of losing something meaningful. The absence of demands highlights the avoidant's own inner void. They begin to feel the difference between solitude chosen and connection lost. Silence strips away the distractions and leaves them with the truth they have been avoiding, that their distance is not safety, but fear. And in the quiet, they begin to realize what they are at risk of losing: the warmth, the devotion, the love of someone who finally chose peace over pursuit. That realization often cuts deeper than any words ever could because it is born not from confronta, but from reflection. Emotional self-mastery is the moment the entire dynamic begins to shift. The anxious partner, so often caught in spirals of overthinking, overfeeling, and overreacting, suddenly finds strength in regulation. Instead of being swept away by panic when the avoidant withdraws, they learn to breathe, to center, to anchor themselves in a place of grounded calm. This transformation is not small, it is seismic. For the avoidant, who has always relied on the anxious person's reactivity as a reason to retreat further, the change is unsettling. They can no longer predict the script. They can no longer point to chaos and say, "This is why I pull away." The emotional independence of the anxious disarms the avoidance distance. It begins with choice, the choice to no longer allow emotions to dictate desperate action. The anxious person starts recognizing that every wave of panic is not a command to run after someone, but an invitation to master themselves. They begin to soothe their inner child, to reassure their own heart, to sit in discomfort without turning it into pursuit. This is where true power lies. Because when you stop outsourcing your emotional regulation to another person, you stop giving them control over your state of being. You reclaim authority over your mind, your body, your spirit, and that reclamation radiates a new kind of strength. The avoidant notices this even if they don't speak it out loud. They see the anxious partner no longer unravel when distance is created. They witness someone who used to be frantic now moving with calm, someone who used to cling now standing firm. That calmness is unnerving because it shines a light on the avoidant's own lack of control. Where the anxious once mirrored their chaos, now they mirror peace. The contrast is undeniable. It makes the avoidant question their assumptions. They begin to wonder if the person they thought was dependent is now self-sufficient. Then what excuse do they have left for their avoidance? Emotional self-mastery does more than shift perception. It changes attraction. Confidence is magnetic and calmness is contagious. When the anxious partner no longer reacts with fear but responds with strength, the avoidant starts to feel drawn back. The very distance they once sought now feels unnecessary because there is no longer suffocating energy pressing against them. Instead, there is balance. There is space without desperation, closeness without pressure. And that balance challenges the avoidant to rethink what intimacy means. What truly strikes the avoidant in this dynamic is that the anxious partner no longer fights for them out of fear, but chooses them from a place of fullness. That choice carries weight. It shows that the anxious no longer needs the avoidant to survive emotionally. They want them, but they don't depend on them. This distinction creates respect. It redefines the anxious not as fragile, but as resilient, not as needy, but as powerful. And in the face of that resilience, the avoidant begins to feel their own vulnerability surface. They realize the game has changed. They are no longer being chased, and in the absence of that chase, they must finally face themselves. Boundaries are not walls, they are mirrors. They reflect back to another person the truth about how you value yourself and what you are willing to accept. For the anxious partner, boundaries can feel terrifying at first. The instinct is to bend, to compromise endlessly, to sacrifice comfort for the illusion of closeness. But the moment the anxious person steps into the power of healthy boundaries, everything changes. No longer do they overextend to keep peace. No longer do they allow their needs to be minimized in the name of love. They draw a clear line, not from anger, but from self-respect. And that line speaks louder than 1,000 arguments ever could. For the avoidant, who has often relied on the anxious partner's endless flexibility, this sudden shift is both confronting and awakening. They are used to someone stretching beyond comfort to hold the relationship together, used to someone softening every edge to avoid abandonment. But when boundaries appear, the avoidant encounters something new, accountability. They are no longer met with someone who will bend at every turn. Instead, they are faced with someone who calmly but firmly says, "This is where I stand." And that firmness is disarming. It makes the avoidant pause. It forces them to recognize that love does not mean limitless tolerance. Boundaries create clarity, and clarity creates contrast. The avoidant, who often thrives in ambiguity, suddenly loses the fog they've been hiding behind. When the anxious partner clearly communicates what is acceptable and what is not, the avoidant sees themselves reflected in that mirror. They see the ways they have avoided responsibility. They see how their fear has shaped the connection. And in that reflection, they begin to realize that the anxious partner's strength is not a threat, but an invitation to step up. Healthy boundaries also transform the anxious partner internally. They no longer equate self-sacrifice with love. They no longer diminish their worth for the sake of keeping someone near. Instead, they honor their needs, their values, and their heart. This internal shift radiates outward. It changes posture, it changes energy, it changes the way the anxious partner speaks and carries themselves. And this transformation does not go unnoticed. The avoidant, who once believed they held all the control by pulling away, now sees that control slipping. The anxious is no longer playing by the old rules. They are no longer grasping to hold on. They are standing tall, not in defiance, but in dignity. For the avoidant, this becomes a wake-up call. Boundaries remind them that love cannot survive without respect, and respect cannot exist without limits. They realize that by testing and pushing, they risk losing the very thing that has always been there for them. And the more the anxious partner honors themselves, the clearer that truth becomes. Boundaries don't push love away, they protect it. They ensure that connection is built on equality, not fear. And in seeing this, the avoidant begins to understand that the real mistake was not the anxious partner's need, but their own resistance to intimacy. Boundaries illuminate this truth like a spotlight, leaving no room to hide. Confidence is the great disruptor of unhealthy dynamics. For so long, the anxious partner often lives in a state of uncertainty, second-guessing themselves, waiting for validation, searching for approval in the eyes of the avoidant. Their posture, their tone, their energy all carry the subtle weight of fear. Fear of being left, fear of being unseen, fear of not being enough. And when someone operates from fear, it shapes the way others perceive them. The avoidant, sensing this desperation, often misinterprets it as weakness. They confuse vulnerability with fragility, closeness with pressure, and devotion with dependence. But when the anxious partner transforms fear into confidence, the entire atmosphere changes. Confidence doesn't shout, it radiates. It's in the way the anxious partner no longer waits anxiously for a message but continues living fully. It's in the way they look into the eyes of the avoidant, not pleading but knowing their worth. It's in the choices they make, choosing peace over drama, choosing self-respect over begging, choosing alignment over compromise that erases their soul. This kind of confidence is magnetic because it creates contrast. It shows the avoidant that the person they thought was dependent is, in fact, powerful. It dismantles the illusion that they were the only one in control. When someone moves with confidence, it shifts perception. Suddenly, the avoidant sees qualities they may have overlooked: strength, resilience, independence, the very traits they feared losing in themselves or reflected in the anxious partner. And this creates both attraction and unease. Attraction because confidence is inherently appealing. It draws people closer, it inspires respect. Unease because it challenges the avoidance narrative. If the anxious partner is no longer needy, no longer dependent, then the avoidant must face their own truth, that perhaps they were never being suffocated, but simply running from their own fears of intimacy. The transformation from neediness to certainty is not about pretending or posturing. It's about embodying the truth that love is a choice, not a lifeline. The anxious partner begins to live from a place of fullness, recognizing that they are whole whether the avoidant shows up or not. They stop equating their value with another's response. And this inner certainty spills into every interaction. The avoidant feels it in the pauses, in the silences, in the moments where the anxious used to crumble but now stand tall. That confidence forces a reevaluation. It makes the avoidant realize they've mistaken devotion for weakness, when in fact the anxious partner's love was always an act of courage. Confidence reframes the relationship dynamic. No longer is one person chasing and the other fleeing. Instead, the anxious partner stands as an equal, choosing, not clinging. And that shift unsettles the avoidant in the best way. They begin to understand that what they once undervalued has immense strength behind it. They see that the anxious partner is not someone who needs them to feel whole, but someone who is whole and simply offering love freely. That realization pierces through the avoidance defenses. It awakens regret, awareness, and often a longing to step forward instead of running away. Because in the presence of confidence, the truth can no longer be ignored. They underestimated someone whose strength was there all along, waiting to be seen. Letting go is often the hardest step, yet it is the one that carries the greatest power. For the anxious partner, holding on tightly feels like survival. Every unanswered message, every moment of distance, every pause in reassurance ignites a storm of fear. The instinct is to grip harder, to push for closeness, to try to control what feels uncontrollable. But the transformation happens when that grip loosens, when the anxious partner finally releases the need to force an outcome. Letting go does not mean giving up. It means surrendering the illusion of control and trusting in the strength of one's own worth. When the anxious partner stops fighting against the avoidance distance and instead chooses peace, the dynamic shifts entirely. No more frantic chases, no more rehearsed speeches, no more exhausting attempts to pull someone closer. Instead, there's freedom. freedom for the anxious partner to breathe again, to reclaim the energy they've been pouring into the other, and to invest that energy into themselves. That kind of release carries a profound message, and I am no longer bound by fear. I choose myself. And the avoidant, who has long relied on the anxious partner's grip to feel desired and secure in their avoidance, suddenly feels the weight of that release. Letting go creates space for silence, for reflection, for the truth to rise. The avoidant, who once found comfort in knowing they were being chased, now faces the reality that no one is chasing anymore. The certainty they relied on is gone. They are left to confront the possibility of losing something irreplaceable. And in that confrontation, realization is born. The avoidant begins to see the love they dismissed, the effort they overlooked, the devotion they underestimated. The absence created by letting go is louder than any words, and it reverberates in their mind like an echo they cannot escape. For the anxious partner, this act of surrender is also deeply spiritual. It is an act of faith in themselves, faith in the truth that love cannot be sustained through fear, faith that what is mean to align will align without force. This spiritual dimension transforms letting go from weakness into wisdom. It shows strength in choosing freedom over bondage, peace over chaos, self-respect over desperation. That choice becomes magnetic. It calls the avoidant back, not through pressure, but through energy, because nothing is more attractive than someone who is free, someone who is whole without clinging, someone who radiates love without demanding it. The avoidant begins to sense that they are no longer in control. The anxious partner's release flips the script. The one who was once terrified of being abandoned has stepped into strength, and the one who once thought they held all the power begins to feel fear, the fear of truly losing what they thought they could always keep at arm's length. In that moment, the avoidance defenses no longer feel like safety. They feel like the very reason they might end up alone, and the realization that they may have mistaken love for pressure, sadness for control, becomes undeniable. And so, when we step back and see the bigger picture, the truth becomes clear. Real transformation in love does not come from chasing, pleading, or proving. It comes from standing in your worth, honoring your boundaries, mastering your emotions, radiating confidence, and finally releasing the grip of fear. The anxious heart becomes powerful not by holding tighter, but by letting go. And in that shift, the avoidant, who once believed they were safe behind their walls, begins to realize the cost of their distance. They see, often with regret, that what they pushed away was the very love their soul was longing for. This is the divine paradox of relationships. When you no longer need to be chosen, you become irresistible. When you no longer fight for control, you step into freedom. And freedom is the soil where true love can finally grow. Thank you for giving your time, your heart, and your attention to this message. Remember, the power to transform and my relationship begins within you. Carry this truth with you, embody it in your daily life, and allow it to elevate not only your connections with others, but your connection with yourself. Stay strong, stay grounded, and above all, stay true to the love that you already are. Until next time, thank you, and may you continue to rise in wisdom, strength, and freedom.